Okay, I'm going to break this drawing down into steps that are way easier to follow than you might imagine, so that you can have a go, create this and amaze yourself. Okay, so as explained in the intro, I'm going to break this down into steps so that you learn not only the painting process and techniques, but also about the app that I'm using and the tools within Procreate. Now, that isn't to say you couldn't use a different app on a different tablet and still follow along, but within the app Procreate, I'm using their default A4 canvas, which is 297 by 210 millimeters at 300 dpi. And the color profile is the sRGB code that ends in 2.1. And again, this is within Procreate by default on the list. In terms of the brushes, I only use the default brushes that come free with the app Procreate. So within inking, I'm going to use the Studio Pen. Within airbrushing, I'll use the soft brush, the medium brush, and maybe the medium hard brush. Within elements, I'll use the clouds brush. And within organic, I'm going to use the rainforest brush. And I may also use the snow gum brush within organic as well. Now, if I amend the brushes in any way, then I will make it very clear at that point in the tutorial. In terms of the colors, well, I've already pre-selected a color palette, and all the colors that I've chosen have linked to them a hexadecimal code. So if you go to the value section within Procreate, there is a section here where you can type them in. Now, I've placed all these codes down in the video description, so you can copy and paste them into this box one at a time. Press enter, the color appears up here, and then you can tap it into the color palette area. Or next to the codes is a link that takes you to my Patreon page, where you can download the whole color file for free to save you some time. And Patreon is also the place where you can support this channel and gain access to exclusive content, such as extended versions of these tutorials and other things. I'd like to say a massive thank you to those people who do support me over at Patreon. It really does make a huge difference, so thank you so much. And with all of that said and done, let's get started. So the first thing I'm going to do is rotate the canvas into its portrait orientation. And this is how we're going to move forward with the whole image. I'm going to go to my colors, click on the color disc. I'm going to tap on the first color on the top row, and I'm going to drag into the canvas area, release, and it flood fills the whole canvas. I'm then going to go back to my color palette, select the second color. I'm going to go to my brushes, airbrushing, soft brush. I'm going to put the size of the soft brush up to 30% and 100% opacity, and about halfway, we'll just do a band of this. Then I'm going to go to the adjustments, Gaussian blur, and I'm going to blur that in, keep sliding it across until we get to about the 80%, and deselect. I'm going to go to my layers and create a new layer, layer 2. I'm going to change brushes. I'm going to go to the elements, clouds brush, go back to my colors, and I'm going to use the third color on the top row, go to the size, I'm going to put it at around, well, let's try the 40% and 100% opacity. And then I'm just going to start tapping in some blocks of this cloud. Really what I'm after is just that top edge, so I want some shapes there initially, but I'll tap a few as it comes down as well. Maybe let it build up a little bit more, tap it a few more times when it comes lower down. Then I'm going to turn it down from 40 to 20. Then I can go in there and just direct that edge a little bit more precisely, bulk it out if I feel it needs to in any places. And it kind of gives us most of the shapes that we're going to need and a really good head start on the textures. Now, once we've got some of those outlines, we'll reduce it down maybe to about 5%, maybe just dial it back a little bit from the 100, maybe put it at 80%, zoom in a little bit, and then with a kind of scribbling motion, I'm just going to start blocking in some more of these areas. I don't want them to be quite as patchy as that. I want this to be more of a solid block, so we can use some of the outlines that it's created and just start to colour in the central area. Now, much of this is going to be obscured by cliffs and other details, so don't worry too much. We can just go in there and just fill in. Make what we've got a lot firmer, a lot more of a solid mass. And just generally scribble it in. Now, I use circular motions just so that we don't see any brush marks, because sometimes if you scribble, you get lines that don't look good. So circular motions will lend itself to the kind of formations, the shapes that we'd want within Cloud anyway. It's a slightly better motion. And we want the horizon line to be a little bit lower than halfway. So we can just, I'm pressing lightly so it becomes a little less strong as it moves further down. Or something like this as well. Maybe just a couple more shapes up here stick out. We use the stamp of the brush, or the brush shape, because the brush itself, when you go in here, has an outline. You can see on the little visualization, and that was useful. But now we can go in here with the smaller sizes, put it back down to the 5, and we can just go in and really control some of those shapes if we want to make it slightly different. Like I say, much of this is going to be covered anyway, so don't worry too much. So that will do. I've got an interesting set of shapes there. I'm going to go to that layer, tap on the layer and put on the alpha lock. A little checkerboard design appears in the background of the thumbnail, and all that means when we go to a brighter colour is that anything we add stops at the boundary within that layer. So I've used the first 3, I'm going to go to the 4th, which is a slightly lighter colour, so I'm going to go for 5% size. In fact, no, I'll go for a little bit bigger, 8%, still at the 80% opacity. And like I say, it's contained within the shapes we've already got, so we start to give it a little bit more depth, variety of distance and tone. I'm just going along the edge initially, but then when we come further away, I can allow some sections here, maybe a section in the middle between those lighter bits that remains a little bit darker. Again, keep some sections dark here, just some lighter areas as we move further down. Again, we don't need to really spend very long on that. Back to our colours, and we'll go for this much lighter colour. So the 5th colour on the top row. I'm going to reduce it down even further now to maybe 3% size, 100% opacity, and zoom in. And we're going to go for this edge. Now, I suppose it's important to imagine where the sun is coming from. So I'm imagining it coming from this direction. So anything that's on this leading edge, pointing towards the sun, it's just going to catch it along that edge a little bit more. So we can just concentrate our energy there initially. And think about where the more of the shadow is going to be. So this might be more of a shadow part. Maybe in here as it folds away from the sun, more shadow in here. That isn't to say we wouldn't get it just touching along the edge. But you're going to get it more dramatically on some edges than others. And then we don't only want it on the very edge, we want it entering into the bulk of the cloud, giving it more shape. So I'm going to bring some more coming into the cloud area as well. And again, it's just about repeating these kind of rounder shapes. We don't want straight lines in any areas really. We want to keep that kind of a shape. So this kind of a fluffy, kind of rounded shapes is useful. Layers of it. Like I say, plenty of these sections are just going to be obscured by other features anyway. So we're only going to really preserve just a narrow section here. It just peeks through. Don't spend too long on this section. You can always go back and refine it a little bit further just for the sections that do actually show through. I'm just getting a sense of it to begin with, and then we can move forward. I think that will probably do for now. Like I say, we can always come back to this, add to it. Before I do that, however, I'm going to go to the adjustments, the Gaussian blur, and I'm going to blur it in maybe about 5%, and it just blurs the inner part of that cloud, softens them in slightly, but it has preserved the very edge because we still have the alpha lock on. I'm going to tap on that layer now, deactivate the alpha lock, and then that allows me to go back to the adjustments, Gaussian blur, and just soften it slightly there as well. It's maybe about 3%. And that brings it together. Okay, I'm going to move on to some of the cliff details and also the water. So we're going to go back to our layers and create a new layer, layer 3. Now I'm going to go to the first colour on the middle row. I'm going to go to the airbrushing medium brush, and I'm going to put it at just into the 2% size and 30% 50% opacity. And I just want to create a line that is going to be our rough horizon line. So maybe about, well, just a little bit more than a third of the way up, not quite half. Hold it and it should snap to a straight line, and you can still move it left and right. Now we want a perfectly horizontal line, but you don't have to judge it by eye. If it's completely off, don't worry, hold your pencil down. I haven't released it yet. Press with another hand, another finger, and then let go of both. And we have a perfectly horizontal line, which is really useful, really helpful. Now, it might not quite close at the edges. We can just go and close it at the very edges, and that allows us to drag from the color circle into that lower area. Now the threshold, because I haven't released the pencil yet, the threshold is too high. If I dial it back, you can see it just snaps to fill in that bottom area now, which is great. So I'll do that again. We did the line, we dragged down from that color circle into the area. Now the threshold is now different. Initially it might have started too much, but you can dial it back. There you go. Now we're not going to preserve much of that color, and it's going to change, but it's a good starting point. Go to our brushes. We'll stay with the medium brush, and we'll stay with the first color on the middle row. I'm going to put the brush size up to 3% and 100% opacity, and we need to start stating where these cliffs and rock features are going to be. And I'm just going to create sort of like a staggered, stepped area here, and I can just drag to fill in that area. Any little anomalies you can just easily scribble over. That happens because we're not using the hardest of brushes, so it has a slightly feathered edge. So when you fill, it tends to leave little anomalies, and that's fine, easy to correct. We'll go over to this side, maybe start from up here this time. So I don't quite want it going off the top of the canvas. Something like this. Again, drag to flood fill in the little gaps and anomalies. Zoom in, and well, this edge, I'm just going to create a slightly rougher texture, some bits that stick out a little bit more, and we're going to use some foliage, distant kind of trees that are clinging to that cliff, and that will create a rougher edge anyway. But I'm also going to use the eraser. I'm going to have the eraser set to the medium brush within airbrushing. 1% size, 100% opacity. I'm going to zoom in, and we can just nibble away at that edge wherever we feel we want, or gaps. And we can do the same over this side as well. I'm going to worry too much about that. We're going to add a lot of features, so it's fine for now. Okay, I'm going to go to my layers and create a new layer, layer 4, and I'm going to go to the second color on the middle row, still with the medium brush, 3% size, 100% opacity, and I'm going to have another section that is perhaps just a little bit closer, juts out a little bit further forward. And again, we can just scribble that in. Don't care about that bottom edge really, maybe just a little bit of a flattening out, like so. And I guess we can do something similar over here too. It'll be quite rough. Flatten it out here. Again, we can just drag to flood fill that area then. Fill in any little anomalies, any gaps. I don't want this to be super noticeable really. We can always go to that layer, tap on the N, and just turn that down a little bit. Maybe it's a little bit too strong, so maybe 50% will work. And I think I prefer the subtle change in tone rather than what we had initially. Then we can create a new layer, layer 5, and go for the third color on the middle row. Still with the same brush, and maybe just create something here as well. Again, that's probably too dark. Have it flattening out at the bottom. Nothing here there's nothing we have created that we can't amend further as we go along. So don't worry too much. Flattening at the bottom. Just flood fill. And again on this layer, I'm going to go tap on the little N, dial it back. I think this one is even less, so maybe about 30% strength, like that. And it's subtle, it's there, it's going to project these slightly further forward than those, but not too dramatically. I might just take those 3 layers and actually merge them together now at that point. Whoops, a bit tricky to do, pinch them together. There you go. Okay, I'm going to go back to my layers again and create a new layer, layer 4 again. It's not the 4th layer we've created, but because we pinched the other ones together, now this is the 4th layer that's open. Back to my colors, I'm going to use the 4th color on the middle row. I'm going to go to the organic rainforest brush. I'm going to have the brush size at the lowest part of 2%, just before it becomes 1. So back up again, maybe 80% opacity. And then I'll zoom in. And really on this edge, anything where there's a little bit of a flatter area, enough for something to grow, I'm going to add this texture. So I want some of the dark shapes to remain, or some of this dark background to remain rather, in the gaps. But I'm just starting to go over it, add distant trees that are clinging to it, organic matter, and especially on a flatter area like this. So when it's on steepest parts, maybe things can't hold on as much, but when we get a little bit of a flattening out, then things can settle and grow there a little bit more easily. Now we'll just bring it back here so it kind of joins, maybe stops, hesitates there at that boundary a little bit. Creeps along here, hesitates at that boundary again. And you can see we're creating the effect of that distant area. It's already starting to build in an effect, and we have barely done anything to it. So again, I'm just being sensitive to that boundary. And then I'm going to treat this side in a similar way. I've got quite a gentle slope on this section, so it's probably going to gather more. More of it will settle more easily. So bring it most of the way down on this area. And then when it reaches this bit, maybe that all of that is just too steep, or the vast majority, so we could just have little suggestions of it here and there, but really not a lot. And then just a few areas here where it just fragments off, kind of disappears. Just tap it a few times. Okay, I'm going to tap on that layer and put, in fact, no, we'll keep it as a separate layer. We'll create a new layer, but we'll tap on it and we'll use the clipping mask, which basically does the same thing as the alpha lock, but it isn't now on a separate layer. So we'll go to the 5th color and we'll turn the rainforest brush down to the 1%, still at the 80% strength, and we can now just pepper in a lighter tone, but it only adds it within the areas that we've already added foliage, just initially anyway. Just tapping it in. I'm going to allow it to be a little bit stronger along that very edge. But then as we come back further here, you can see I can't add it anywhere where we haven't already added the green, which is the point of the clipping mask. Very useful, stops you going overboard and just filling in all those shadow gaps. So if you didn't put the clipping mask on top of the green you've already added, you'd add a load more light green, and before you knew it, all those darker tones that we want to keep as gaps would disappear. That's a good way of just keeping us being a little bit more conservative with what we're adding, a bit more restrained. You don't keep checking, like if you're using real paint, you would step back from your canvas. Using digital, so we need to zoom out instead. Check the overall effect. Is it working? You need to apply more, and so on. So again, I'm just preferencing this top edge. The sunlight is coming from over here, so it definitely will catch that top edge. You'll hit more of it over here, but here you're going to get a thin line across this foliage. You can have it a little bit more than that as well, but definitely to begin with, a strong line there. And the sun's going to be quite high, so it might actually clip more of it than just the very edge. I'm going to create a new layer, layer 6, and I'm going to go probably back to the 4th colour, this green, and I am going to start creating some here as well. So still with the rainforest brush, I'm perhaps going to put it up to just into the 2, 80% opacity, and I'm going to bring some foliage over the top here as well. Along this edge. Again, preserve some of those blue gaps. Now, what we can do with this brush is we can go on it, tap on it, and we can change the spacing from 27 up to maybe 40%. Click done. And when we go back in, we just have a slightly bigger spread. We could put this up to the higher part of 2%. And it just creates slight more separation within that texture, which might be quite useful as it comes closer to us. Be a little bit more sensitive to this boundary as well. Not quite as much as we were before, but a little bit. Again, just allow it to kind of disappear as we come down here as well. Now we come over to this side. We'll just bring some of it along here. Bring it along here. I might just have a little part that shoots off over here actually, and then also continues down here. Perhaps I'll go back to the spacing. The spacing is not needed for all the parts. I'm going to perhaps have it at maybe 30%, almost by default settings really. And then I'm going to start building some along this shape as well. Okay, I'll probably go to layer 6, put on the alpha lock, and I will go to this most vibrant green, which is the 7th colour along. Perhaps just turn that further down to the 1%, 80% strength still. And again, we just want to bring some of this really vibrant green here. Now there's a difference. It's a much warmer, bright green, so this should start to project some of this a little bit further forward. Create this sense that that's more distant than this area. It's going to be quite subtle, but it should start to become more apparent anyway. So don't put this colour up at the top, and you can't do anyway because we've not got that area selected. It only is really possible to start adding it here. Bring some of this along that top edge, just like we did there. Bring it further down, just touching the edges here as well. We don't want it all over, we want it to be sort of dispersed. We'll perhaps create a separate layer for this in a moment, and we can go over the top of what we've already created, really build it up even more. So we'll do that now. We'll go and create another layer, layer 7. We'll zoom in, and we're down at the 1%. Perhaps I'll put it up to 100% strength this time, and then I can really build this in even more dramatically where I want it to be. Again, we're keeping these kind of shapes similar to what we did with the clouds. I'm also tapping it in a little bit as well. And you can see that effect now. It creates more of a sense of closer to in this section than it does there. It's not huge, but it does make a difference. And then we can just go over some of these edges again. Again, preserve that rounder shape. A little bit along that edge, catching the light. Not really up there, remember, we just want this slightly more yellow, warm green as we're encroaching closer. We can always go back in and add more of this green foliage if we feel it's necessary a little bit later, but for now, that's probably a good start for us. So we'll leave it at that point for this moment, and then we'll go to our layers and create a new layer, layer 8. And we're going to go in with the airbrushing medium hard brush. I'm going to go to the 8th colour on the middle row. I'm going to have it quite small, maybe adjust into the 2% size and about 50% opacity. And I'm going to start building in some kind of rock shapes in this section. So it's subtle initially. I'm going to start with a kind of downwards movement generally, just some lines and dashes. Start to tap in those kinds of gestures. We just want to subtly start to suggest a downward direction. So once you've done a collection of kind of dashes in an area, we could block in shapes. I'll zoom in even more. You can see perhaps there's gaps. I'm just doing sections now, like little rectangles almost. They don't really join together. They remain separated. Do lots of little ones too, as well as some bigger flat panels and sections. And it just creates some texture in there without really a lot of time and effort. We'll do something for this middle area too, just light enough to kind of make it out in this colour, definitely in that one, although it is still subtle and only just in this section. Move over to the side, and again, start to add some of this. You can notice a lot more here. So if you want to start just with the downward movement, just to get a general sense of it first, and then you can start blocking in larger sections. Now, some of the rocks might actually, as well as down, you might have a slight slope in the direction. We can't use this color for that, but just for these front areas, we're going to have more of a downward tilt. We can block them together. Okay, we're going to go for the 9th color on the middle row, and you should be able to see this a lot more clearly. So we're going to turn the opacity down to maybe 30%, and we're just going to be a little bit careful initially. So in addition to the subtler tones we've already added, we can start to add just some of this lighter color in there as well. Again, kind of rough kind of panels of this tone. When we come over to this section now, we'll start to notice it more than we did that other blue, and that's great. And we can also start to add it in over here as well. Now, we might get a slight sense of a change in direction with this as well. So if we've got more of a slope rather than straight down, we might just angle it slightly at a bit of an angle. Do the brush marks as a bit of an angle, I should say. And then in addition to that, we could also start bringing in some of this texture. Perhaps we'll turn it down even further to the 1%. We can start bringing some of these textures into some of the gaps between the foliage that we left as well. I'm going to turn the opacity of it up to 50%. And then when you add it in and amongst here, it really is a little bit more noticeable. We definitely want to see some of this blue tone. We're going to add an even warmer highlight to areas, but where we don't add the warm, I want this cool colour to remain. Now, I feel in some ways like we've got a lot of that green foliage. I'm going to go back to the green foliage layers. I'm going to take layers 4 to 7, and I'm going to pinch them all together. Tricky to do, but persevere, and they're all on one layer now. That means I can go back to what is now layer 4 with the eraser, set the eraser to the organic rainforest brush, and put it down, maybe 2% size, 100% opacity. And if there are any areas I just want to subdue, remove slightly, give me a little bit more area to play with the rock, then I can go in and do that. It's easy to get carried away when you're adding one element, but then you can always dial it back. I'm going to go back up to layer 8, back in with the medium hard brush, back in with the colours and the settings that we're using before. Like I say, you can just continue to add some of these rock colours in here. Now, as well as kind of rectangles or square shapes, you can have longer shapes that can come all the way down and meet where the water is going to be. We haven't really decided the water line yet, and that's fine. But we can have some longer shapes. Now, I feel that will do mostly for that side. I'm going to come over here, and as I was saying before, we could have a change of direction. It doesn't all have to go completely downward. Could be going with the angle. We've got the slope suggested here with the greenery, so perhaps we could have a few more lines in that direction as well, in the rock. Let it split apart. At least for a section, doesn't need to be the whole thing, maybe just 1 or 2 areas. Use the little bumps that stick out as a guide, so maybe from that point then cutting through. So we have a section here, it gives us an edge. Use that as inspiration. Because the colours kind of work, we don't really need to spend a long time worrying about these textures. Just play with them. Don't forget to add some little shapes in the gaps as well. It doesn't all want to be just one size. That won't work either. You want some variety in there. But because the colours are set right to create the effect, then, with a few shapes and a few gestures, actually the effect is kind of built in. So maybe in this area I'll have a mixture of downward and slanted. We're just creating kind of quite random shapes really. Your imagination kind of will fill in the details. Now I'll come back to that layer, but we're going to create a layer above it, layer 6, and go back to our colours. We're going to use the last colour, 10th colour on the middle row, and I'll zoom in, and we're going to add, when the sun hits it directly, it's going to create a really strong, warmer, more vibrant highlight. So I've got this set to 1%, size, 50% opacity, And we're going in some of these rock areas now, and the sun is going to hit it and just give you a strong light color. And this is really what's going to bring out a really nice feature. So any bits of rock that are just angled towards the sun more, perhaps catch light and just bring out this warm hue. And then I'm going to leave that section here, so we've got some of the blue still remaining. I don't want to completely eliminate the blue tones. They are the kind of shadow parts that turn away from the sun. And then we'll move further down here, maybe just along this edge. You can have a kind of smattering of this colour, allow it to be a little bit more fragmented and broken. Maybe trace along the edge a little bit just to preserve some of those shapes. But then I'm just tapping in as well. And then as it peels round the corner, we'll have slightly less of that, and then it just becomes more of a shadow area there. So we don't really want to add too much in that area. Maybe the front of here just catches the light. Now I'm going to shift and adjust the bottom edges of these to suit the water and distance. I'll tidy them up. But for now, we're just going to go in there and add some of these highlights. Tap them in, and you can see the effect is really bringing it all together as a 3D mass. And it's not going to creep round to this side really. We'll keep that all in shadow, and it is important to have the contrast between the lit areas and the shadow areas. Without that, we don't get the effect. And in that sense, most of this is going to remain in shadow, apart from just the occasional bit of rock that just sticks through and catches the light, but not much. In fact, almost nothing on this area compared to this. Okay, I'll come back to some of those details. We will refine the rock and other things a bit more, but we're going to add another layer for now. Layer 7. I'm going to go in with the medium, in fact, we'll stick with the medium hard brush. I'm going to go with the 8th colour on the bottom row and put the brush size at 3% and 100% opacity. And I just want to clip the bottom of this area. So we've got a much smaller, shallower difference between the distant rocks and the foreground rocks. You can see there's a gap of about that much. Might even reduce that a bit further. So there's really not a huge distance between them. Whenever you get a big distance between the bottom of one shape and another one, it increases the sense of relative distance from each other. We don't want too much of that. So once I've set that, I can just drag into the bottom area, just fine tune that. Now it's a very vibrant blue. I don't want that blue remaining very much, but it's a good starting point. I'm going to put it down to the low on the 2%, and then we'll extend that blue up a little bit beyond this corner. So just a hint beyond that, and you can see a little step now, and that's really enough of a step. And then on this side, just to create a slight separation, we'll just extend that further up as well. We'll add more light tones. When you can see now you've got like a step and a step, one there and one there, and that's enough to create a sense of layering and distance. Now we're going to have to try and channel some of that light through as a reflection into the water. But to begin with, we're going to start with the 9th colour, still with the medium hard brush, 5% size. We're going to turn it down now to about 30% opacity, and we're just going to start with the edges, add some darker tone. We've got the shadow, or the reflection rather, coming down from the cliffs on that side, the rock on that side, so we can start to shut down some of the light on this part, and we'll do the same on this side, just subtly, just suggestive to begin with. Rotate it slightly if it makes it a little bit easier. And the darker tones are also going to be greater when they get closer to us, so we'll put that up to 15% size, and we'll just tap that in a few times in the bottom area and then allow it to fade up like that. Now again, the blues are not right kind of blue to begin with, but as an underpinning, a starting point, then it's fine. I'm going to go to my layers and create a new layer, layer 8. Back to my colours. I'm going to use the First colour on the bottom row. I'm going to stick with the medium hard brush, 5% size, 100% opacity, and we're going to have some really foreground rocks, almost like we're looking through a cave out onto the water. And we're just shutting down some of the light in this top corner. Maybe have it stopping about here. Maybe just a more foreground little section here as well. Something like this. I'm going to tap on that layer, put on the alpha lock. I'm going to go to the soft brush with an airbrushing, 10% size, 70% opacity. Maybe just darken this one up a little bit, and also along this edge, not on this bit that will hit the light nearly, but just along this very edge of the canvas, just a little bit darker. Now within that shape, I'm going to go for the third colour. I'm going to go to the medium brush with an airbrushing, 2% size, maybe 90% opacity, and we'll zoom in a bit. And then I'm just going to put some shapes. Just a smattering of smaller kind of shapes that could be part of rock texture. Again, allow some bits to kind of block together. Maybe I'll turn it down even further. Maybe I'll turn it down even further to the lowest part of 2%. And we can just add some stretched out little dashes, collect near the edge, but then as they get further away, we get more of this black gap spacing. Again, just a few dashes along that very edge. Bring it further down. And it's subtle. It's really not, you know, it doesn't have to shout at all. And then as we come further down here, we can just continue that. Just some dashes. The gaps are super important, so don't block it all in completely. Now I might create a little bit of a split in here. So a section there, and then some that are just close to it. Well, it leaves a gap between them there, importantly. And then we can just take that up to the edge here as well. Now it isn't an overly thought about texture. It's quite, you know, freely applied. I'm really not agonizing over this at all. And then we'll go right up to the very edge with this as well. Whereas on this side, we're allowing some of the dark colour to remain. When we get closer to the edge, we're going to have more of this lighter tone. And then down on this section too. Something like this. Go back to our colours. Perhaps we'll go for the fourth colour, which is slightly lighter. Zoom in. And then maybe with a lighter or lower opacity, maybe at 50%, we can just start to add more of this too, as it gets closer to that edge, certainly. This is like our transition colour. And then we're going to have a really vibrant, bright colour along the edge, just the sun creeping in a little bit, but we're not quite there yet. Some of that light colour just along this top edge as well. Bring some of these dashes right up to the very edge, slightly angled. Let's check up here. Yeah, I suppose we're going to have some of this colour here as well. Then I'm going to do exactly that. I'm going to move along to a warmer, more vibrant colour. So it is now the sixth colour on the bottom row. Move in here, we're at 50%, and there you can see it just peeking around this edge, clipping just sections of it. And you can see it brings out the sun quite nicely. We'll keep this one in shadow. And this is with the alpha lock on. We can always turn the alpha lock off in a minute, and then we can just refine this edge a little bit. It just helps us get started. Okay, we're going to go to our layers and create a new layer, layer 9. Probably going to put that layer underneath layer 8. Going to go to the airbrushing soft brush this time, and I'm going to go for the 9th colour. In fact, no we won't, we'll go for the 8th colour on the top row to begin with. I'm going to put the brush size to 5%, 50% opacity, and we're just going to channel down the light from that centre area. So it starts off narrow, which just careful don't go over the top there. I did a little bit. Could always go in with a reduced size brush, but we're just bringing this down and having it broadening out in the bottom area. And basically what we want to do is just create the reflection of the darker areas below. So this area reflected here, and then obviously this shape reflected here, roughly speaking. Once we've done that, we can then go in with the 9th colour, 2% size, and we'll just a bit more carefully adjust that near that top edge. And then in addition to that other brighter colour, we're bringing this down as well, channeling the light down 6% or so. Then I'm going to put it up to 10% size, 10% or so opacity, and then just this kind of central area, I'm going to add a bit more of that light colour, just generally a bit of a haze of it, something like that. We're going to stay on that same layer, but we're going to go to the inking studio pen. We're going to stay with the 9th colour. I'm going to rotate it because it's easier to work with. 20% size, maybe 50% opacity, and I'm just going to bring in more tentatively now, just some lines that cut across. Just having it peeking out from the edges of that a little bit. So I'm respecting the edges of that colour somewhat, but cutting across it. Maybe have some dashes, little sections that are breakaway. Not too many though. It is also pressure sensitive, so you press on hard, you get bigger shapes. So I'm not pressing on very hard. We're starting to bring some dashes across. We need to make sure that they are roughly horizontal. We don't want them going too astray. So zoom out if you need to, just make some adjustments if you've gone off, which I have. Maybe turn it down to the 20% opacity and maybe bigger on the sides, maybe 50%. And we can just bring in some shapes here closer to as well. Get some smaller dashes, some gaps. This is all going to be about layering. We can just keep layering and layering this. Maybe extend some of them off towards the edges a little bit more. Don't forget this middle area as well. We want some of this to cut through. We're going to have quite a lot of variation of different hues, different tones. Okay, stay on the same layer. Perhaps we'll go for the 10th colour, maybe from this side. Now it's underneath the rocks that are in the foreground, so we don't need to be too worried. We can just add some of this vibrant blue over at this side, perhaps some over here. We've got it on a really low opacity. Maybe we could put it up more, 30%. Let's rotate that. Bring some of that blue in here. Maybe on this side too. Check, see the progress, see how it works, and maybe we'll go for a dark colour, maybe the 9th colour on the bottom row. And we're going to have to start bringing in some dark reflection and also shadow, I suppose, on the water. But reflection is, I guess, the main way of thinking about it. But yeah, shadow too. Just create some shapes that are jutting in from this edge either way. And you can have separate kind of blobs and little ripples that emerge. They can extend a little bit further up as well, but definitely down in this area. Shut down some of the light in this little corner, and below here too. You can have it encroaching into the central area. Little breakaway sections. Some longer lines as well. Check progress. I'm quite liking the impact that's starting to build in. Could join some of these up a little bit, just cut a line through. And again, well, we've got the 7th colour on the top row. That's quite a dark colour. We've still only got it at 30% opacity, so we can go over it a few times. We'll just go along the bottom edge of the rocks where it meets the water. Seems appropriate that we'd have a really nice dark tone there. Bring it in along the edge and down here as well. And that's starting to make sense of this section a little bit better. Quite a bit happier with that. But then we've also got this really strong, vibrant light area too. So we need to reflect that in the water, but I'm not going to use the warm colours. I'm going to use a blue colour, but a lighter blue. Just take some of these darker ripples in and around these areas too. Again, this is all about layering. So we'll go back to our colours, maybe use the first colour on the top row, and then we're bringing some of that down. So let's just set the size a little bit lower, maybe 30%, and a little bit higher, maybe 50%. Bring in some of that sense of light anyway, at the very least. Doesn't need to be the colours, strictly speaking. But we're just bringing some smaller, more controlled dashes of that down into the water. We've got a lean, so if you think about it here, it leans that way, it should lean this way as well. Somewhat, not strictly, because water does strange things to distort, but in a rough sense. You can zoom out and you can see that effect is quite good. That works. I quite like that area. You can have one or two just break away. Doesn't have to be as neat as that. Just one or two breakaways works. Now we've got this central area. We're really going to have to get that right. So we'll go for the, perhaps not actually, we'll go for the fourth colour. It's quite a lot brighter. Let's just zoom in, turn it down to 20%, size 50% opacity, and let's just tentatively put in some dashes near that horizon. Keep them quite close together and press lightly. As we come further down, we can just start to bring them in more and more. Again, allowing some gaps, some bands of separation between them. Zoom out, check. That's starting to build in a nice effect. Kind of zigzagging, but not in an obvious way, just backwards and forwards, rocking, building in more of this light in the central area. Check progress, a bit more of it. And this is going to be probably the most tricky area to get right, so spend some time, keep checking. As we come further down, we're going to get larger individual shapes. You can press on more, allow bigger gaps between them. You can also have some just kind of random little bits that are near the edge. Turn the opacity down maybe as we get closer to us. 30%, size up to 30% or so. And as we come down here, we can have bigger separations in some of these shapes. I perhaps want to just keep the whitest of colours in that upper central area. Let's go over this a little bit more. Go for the fifth colour, which is pretty much white. It's the white we used in the cloud, so that definitely needs to be included. Turn that back down again, maybe 10%. Just fine tune that horizon a little bit, just so it almost blends in with the sky. We want it really subtle. You can't quite see exactly where it ends. And then bring some of this whitest colour down somewhat. Now we've got it quite a low opacity. We can put it up maybe a little bit more, 50%. Have it quite strong. Channel some of that light down in that centre area. Create more of the ripples, backwards and forwards. And again, we want that to kind of dissipate out quite quickly. I don't want it down in this lower area too much. I think I'll go back to layer 8 and turn off the alpha lock. And I think I'm going to add more rock features on either side. So we started with the first colour on the bottom row. We'll go in with the airbrushing medium hard brush, 10% size, 100% opacity, and we'll just bring something in on this side too. Not too much. And then maybe some rock features just jutting in here as well. Let's turn it down 3% and we can fine tune anything there. We'll have it meeting the water at this point, like so. Now we need to go and tap on it, put on the alpha lock, go back in with some of these lighter colours or the darker colour as well. Although Not too much of that. Perhaps I'll just skip to the third colour. We had a similar texture we need to add, so low on the 3% size, maybe 50% opacity. And we have the alpha lock on, so it can be rough in the application. Just to add some of this in. I'm going to create bands, you can see. I'm going to create like an angle similar to what we did on this, where we've got stripes almost cutting through the rock. I'm going to create some separation. Go to my colours, maybe I'll go straight to the vibrant colour, the 6th colour, 2% size, 50% opacity, and yeah, I'm just going to add this to the very edge, just like we had on these, and just on the edge of that, I'm going to have more of it along here. Really nice, vibrant colour, I think it's needed. Perhaps I'll even turn off the alpha lock now. Bring some of these colours. We are on the medium hard brush. Put it even lower on the 2% size. Bring in some of these extra vibrant tones. I think it actually adds a great deal to this. I'm going to turn this down even further into the 1%. It can just be a little bit more precision. Add some smaller textures in the mix. Maybe I'll go for something even more vibrant. Maybe the colour, 10th colour on the middle row. Turn it up 80% strength on the edge. In fact, maybe just go for a white. Maybe go for this next colour, which is the 7th colour on the bottom row. I need to turn that back down to probably the 50 strength and 1% size. Maybe I could just add this as a brightening of the warm colours we've already got. Just a touch of it anyway, not too much. And I think we need some more of that blue. So maybe we'll go along to these two colours. We'll go for maybe the 5th colour. Still with the medium hard brush, 2% size, 50% opacity. And well, we need the shadow part. So we've got the strong highlight, but then in the shadow, we're going to have kind of secondary reflected light, ambient light, more kind of bouncing in the shadow area. So we don't want it to be completely featureless, not when it's this close to us. So we can add more detail now in that shadow part. That is quite bright. We'll go back to the 4th colour and yeah, we'll just create some more texture in here, running along there, and then even more of it. And really it's just the contrast of the colours that creates this effect. The texture that we're actually adding is only a minor part of it. It does count, but if you get the colours right, then it does a lot of the work for us. Okay, so that'll do for that rock area. Perhaps need to add some of the blue into these upper areas too. I've turned off the alpha lock, so just be a little bit mindful of that, a bit careful. Not really going to get much of the highlight here. Perhaps a little bit. We could go back to the 7th colour, sorry, the 6th colour. We could add just a little bit of it if it's needed. I don't really want to do too much of that along there, just a hint. Then we've got the issue of reflection, the dark area on the water. So we probably need to go back to layer 9 again with the inking studio pen. And well, we used this colour, didn't we? It was the 7th colour on the top row. 50% opacity, 30% size, and we need to bring in some of this darker tone on this side. Again, it's underneath the rock, so we can't be too destructive. Bring it in from the side. That joins it, that kind of binds it to the water a little bit better. That's starting to work. We'll come back to the water, but we'll create a new layer. So go to the top, create a new layer on top, layer 10. I'm going to go to the organic snow gum brush. I'm going to tap on it. We'll change the spacing to 20 and the jitter to 40%. And click done. Now, I realise perhaps I've not got all the greens that I'm going to need, but that's fine. I can use other methods. So I'm going to go to the 4th colour on the middle row. I'm going to put the brush size at 6% and 100% opacity. And I'm just going to add some of this green here initially. Just a smattering of it through there and along some of this edge. And well, then we can go to the adjustments, the hue, saturation and brightness, and I can turn the brightness down to maybe 40%. deselect, and that's created the darker part of what I need, and then I could just go over it again with the same brush, or rather the same colour and the same brush, and create some more highlights. Then I can go back to the adjustments, the hue, saturation and brightness, and turn the brightness of it down even further, maybe 45%. And that's the kind of the colour variation that I was looking for, really. And we can do something similar over here. So I probably need to create a new layer because I've already changed the darkness and the brightness. So I'll start with the fourth colour along, same settings on the brush, and just bring this out, encroaching on our scene a little bit more, like so. Then I'm going to go to the adjustments, the hue, saturation and brightness, and we turned it down to 40%. That's great. We'll add a little bit more in a similar way, just a smattering of an even lighter tone. And back to the hue, saturation and brightness, and just turn it down to the, we had it to the 45. So again, that probably works quite nicely. We can always go back in with the inking studio pen, use something like the first colour on the bottom row, 30% size, maybe 100% opacity, and we can just go in there and we can create some branches that connect these together a little bit, just peeking through some of the gaps. Don't feel inclined to really overly agonize over the details of this. Just a suggestion, goes quite a long way. And then I'm going to do some foliage perhaps that's just on the rocks. So I'm going to merge those two together, pinch them together. Perhaps I'll create a new layer for this, layer 11. I'm going to go back to the organic snow gum brush. I'm going to go in with the fourth colour again, just create some foliage on here, just some things that are growing a little bit, not much. Then go back to the fifth colour, brighten that up a little bit. Then go to the brightest of colours here, which is the seventh, or the warmest green anyway. Add some of that, not too much. And maybe we could add some of that green over here, so you've just got some bits of greenery that's poking through here. And then go backwards, maybe the fourth green, just as it's coming around this side a little bit more. A couple of suggestions goes a long way. Maybe some rocks that are a little bit further away, so we can create a new layer, layer 12. We'll go for the fifth colour. We'll go back to maybe the inking studio pen, 30% size, 100% opacity, and again we're just using maybe the fifth colour on the bottom row. Zoom in just a little bit. We can just add some rocks that are coming into this area. Not too many. Then we can go back in with the sixth colour, the warm, and again we can just add some highlights on the top of those few rocks. Kind of a detail. There's definitely a need for some rock texture, so we'll go back to layer 8, go back to the colours up here, we'll go for the 9th colour, and we'll go in with the airbrushing medium hard brush, 2% size, 50% opacity, and yeah, we'll just add some more rock texture up here. It does look too empty. We did say we'd come back to it, so this is the point. Again, just a downward movement, a slight angle perhaps in a similar way that we've got here. It's a layer underneath all the other features, so we don't need to be worried about neatness. It's not going to interfere with really very much at all, so you can be quite loose with it. Check progress, see whether we like it or not. I'm going to put the opacity perhaps up to 100%. That way it's just going to ramp it up even more in places. Okay, I'm happier overall with the image. It just needs a little bit of refinement with the water still. So we're going to go back up to that layer, which is layer 9, where we've got all the water. We'll go back in with some of the darker tones, perhaps. We'll go maybe to the 3rd colour on the middle row, 2% size, 100% opacity, and we'll just bring in Maybe a slight dark tone at the bottom of the water, or bottom of the rock area rather. Seems to make sense. You'd have a little bit of a darker tone there. Darker tone off at the edges, the bottom of these rocks probably. You'd need some darkness. I'm going to turn it up. 4% size, 20% opacity. Again, just bring some of this darkness in from the edges a little bit more. I'm going to go in with the 9th colour. I'm going to go back to the inking studio pen, and little bits in the rock there we need to just reflect down, so we're going to put it to maybe 20% size, 50% opacity, and then we just want to bring down some of these shapes down here, maybe even lower down on the size, actually maybe 15. Reflect down some of those highlights. And then also from up there as well, turn on its side. I mean, much of these textures don't look great close up, not when we're speeding through it at this rate, but if you want to spend longer, then do so. Bring some of these lines all the way across. Don't forget to have some kind of separation. You can start bringing some of that down. That starts to work quite nicely. Put the intensity of that up, maybe 70%. Turn it down to 10%. Bring some of that colour down in more precise kind of ripples. And that's going to be something we need to work on all over. I'm going to put the size up to 30%, and then we're going to bring some like separation. We've got long streaks, but we need more of these little breakaway textures too, throughout the scene really, throughout the water. This is a pretty vibrant colour, so I don't want to do too much of that colour. Maybe just 1 or 2 in this area, but then maybe we'll go for the 10th colour on the top row. Make some separation, some gaps between these colours. Bring some more in here as well. Having it jutting in. And then as we come down here, we need more of the muted colours. Maybe the first colour on the middle row. Bring that colour in. Again, allow some separation. Eighth colour, top row. Bring some streaks of it across here. And we're creating complications really. We're just trying to vary it up so it becomes more and more interesting. You could spend a long time doing this. I'm trying to cut through it at a pace for the sake of the tutorial, but you could definitely spend a long time doing these little shapes and separations. And I do encourage that. I think it will benefit from a bit longer perhaps. Okay, I'm going to go to the airbrushing soft brush. I'm going to go to maybe the 8th colour on the bottom row and just try a few different colours. So maybe 5% size, 15% opacity. Bring in some of this blue down here. And then maybe go back to the 9th colour and the inking studio pen again, and just for some highlights I just wanted to darken up some of these areas. I've got this coming through as well. Opacity is quite strong. Let's put that down 40%. Just some final kind of textures here. Okay, one more layer, layer 13. Just some final subtle touches. Airbrushing, medium hard brush. I'm going to go for perhaps the first colour on the middle row. 1% size, 50% opacity, and maybe just a suggestion of something back here. Some extra things that, well, we don't need to really spell out what they are, but just something back there. Maybe we can go back to the white, the 5th colour, and well, I suppose with an even stronger opacity, maybe 70%, 1% size, we could go in there and just sharpen up some of these clouds. They're a little bit too soft perhaps in places. We could just sharpen it up. Most of the rest of the image is pretty sharp, so create a few little extra details there maybe. Turn the opacity down 30%, maybe just add some extra definition on some of these clouds in this lower area. We left it quite blank, so I'm just going to go in there and just create some more edges, just a little bit more texture. Up into the 2%. Okay, I'm going to turn the opacity down 20%, and just with the soft brush still, just channel some of that light a little bit more in here. Just a couple of passes of that. Okay, I'm going to leave this tutorial here at this point. I hope you've enjoyed following along. Do remember to hit subscribe if you haven't done already, and I shall see you back here soon. Bye for now.